What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christopher from the Duran, and I have with me Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran.com. And today we're going to be talking about Lockheed Martin's $1 billion contract to rival Russia and China in hypersonic weapons. So, Alexander, you've written a few pieces on this, and you've reported extensively on Putin's March 1st speech, where he introduced, I believe it was six weapons of the future that Russia has been developing and is ready to roll out. Some of them are actually in operation today, and a lot of these weapons hinge on their hypersonic ability. Although these missiles and these weapons that Russia rolled out, and now the U.S. is getting in on the hypersonic action to rival Russia and China as well. So explain to our viewers exactly what is a hypersonic weapon or a hypersonic missile, and why you feel the U.S. either needs to get in this game or is just wasting taxpayer dollars by getting into this game.
Right, hypersonic missiles are missiles that fly at 5 to 6 times or more, 5 to 6 times or more than the speed of sound. So they are missiles of extraordinary speed, much faster than supersonic missiles, which typically fly at around 2 to 3 times the speed of sound. And the important thing to understand about hypersonic missiles is that there is no technical means in existence at the moment to intercept them. So a country which possesses hypersonic missiles and can launch them against targets and can launch them accurately can be confident that it will destroy those targets, because there is no defense in existence at the moment to those missiles. Now, the Russians have shown over the last few weeks and months that they are, in fact, fully on top of this technology. They've developed a whole range of these hypersonic missiles. Some of them launched from aircraft, some of them launched from land-based rockets, some of them launched from ships. The United States at the moment has none. So the United States perceives a hypersonic gap between itself and Russia. It also suspects that China is also ahead of it in developing these hypersonic missiles. So it is now trying to close that gap by developing hypersonic systems of its own. And the Lockheed Martin contract that you were talking about is an example of this. I'm going to make a quick observation, which we can no doubt develop further over the course of this discussion. But it is clear to me why the Russians want hypersonic missiles and the enormous benefits they gain from those. It is also clear to me why the Chinese might want them. For the United States to have hypersonic missiles, it is less clear that they are so useful to the United States as they are to the Russians and the Chinese, because of the particular configuration of its military and because of the particular configuration of the Russian and Chinese militaries. The Russian and Chinese militaries are structured in a way that makes them less vulnerable to missiles of this kind.
And so why then is the U.S. going to invest close to $1 billion with Lockheed Martin to develop these hypersonic missiles? And why are they so much a benefit for Russia and China? Can you develop that line of thinking a little better, and also develop why this is really not a proper use of funds for the U.S. military in just getting into a hypersonic weapons race?
Right. Let's begin as for why they are useful for the Russians and the Chinese, because I think that is where that is the good starting point of this. The Russians and the Chinese, when they look at the United States, see that they are confronted by the United States with two particular challenges. One is this great fleet of oceanic warships that the United States has, these 9 supercarriers, basically floating air bases, which the United States has, which weigh 100,000 tons, with thousands of crews and powerful aircraft stationed on them, and which are protected by fleets of Aegis-class destroyers, in them also large weapons and large ships operating in these big fleets. The United States is also heavily involved in developing anti-ballistic missile interceptors. It is stationed anti-ballistic missile interceptors in Europe, in South Korea, on the sea, in some of these destroyers, and in the United States itself. These are configured to shoot down long-range ballistic missiles, supposedly from countries like Iran and North Korea, but actually, as everybody knows, from Russia and China, to provide the US from a defense from these missiles. Now, the Russians and the Chinese do not have analogous systems. They do not have these vast oceanic fleets, and they do not have land-based anti-ballistic missile defenses. So from their point of view, developing hypersonic missiles enables them both to knock out these anti-ballistic missile defenses that the United States is stationing in all sorts of places, and also to ensure that their missiles, their ballistic missiles, can penetrate these defenses. And at the same time, it enables them to attack very effectively this huge oceanic fleet that the United States has. Now, when the United States, from its side, looks at Russia and China, it's not obvious what targets it has in Russia and China that it can use hypersonic missiles against, because the Russians and the Chinese do not have these vast oceanic fleets. Their warships tend to be very much smaller and more lightly armed, and they haven't invested, the Russians and the Chinese haven't invested so heavily in anti-ballistic missile defenses. So from a US point of view, it makes less sense. But why is the US doing it? Well, I think there are various reasons. Firstly, there is a prestige reason. The United States never likes to appear to be behind the Russians and the Chinese in advanced weapons development. And secondly, there is always an economic aspect with weapons development. The military-industrial complex always benefits from these sort of orders, so they'll be able to say, as we have seen with Lockheed Martin, we can't let ourselves fall behind the Russians and the Chinese in these developments, and we must spend huge amounts of money to catch up with them, even though the military rationale for doing so is not obvious.
Alexander, can you go into some more detail for our viewers? A little bit more detail. We know some things about the Russian hypersonic weapons. Can you go into some detail as to what they're named, what they're called, and how they work? And also go into a little bit of detail, if you know, because I personally have not heard of China's hypersonic weapons program. But if you know something, can you also relay that to our viewers?
Right. Now, so far as we know, the Russian hypersonic missile programs are far and away the most developed. They're far ahead of those of the US, and they seem to be ahead of China's as well. Now, they divide into two types. Firstly, there are those for strategic missiles. In other words, for ballistic missiles that the Russians have, which are targeted against the continental United States or against US strategic facilities in places like Europe. Now, these are warheads. These are hypersonic warheads. They're like gliders, if you like, that are launched by these missiles high into the atmosphere, that then fly through the atmosphere at these extraordinary speeds. It's believed that these warheads fly or glide at something like 10 times the speed of sound. They're faster than normal hypersonic missiles. The Russian version of this is called the Avant-Garde, and when it strikes a target, not only can it not be intercepted, but apparently it can be maneuvered, which is something which seems extraordinary, and nobody has understood how it can be done, but apparently the Russians have found a way. It can be maneuvered, and there is no defense against it. And when it strikes, apparently it does so with the impact of a meteor. So we're talking about a devastating strategic weapon. Now, alongside those weapons, the Russians have developed a whole line of smaller hypersonic missiles that seem to be primarily based to attack ships. There is the Kinjal missile, which is launched by the MiG-31 fighter, which is one of the missiles that President Putin discussed in his program in his speech in March. There is the KH-32 missile, which is launched by the Tupolev 22M3 bomber, which seems to be specifically intended to destroy US aircraft carriers. And then there is the Zircon anti-ship missile, which is launched by submarines and surface warships, and which also seems to be primarily intended to destroy other warships. So there is this two-sided program in Russia to develop strategic systems like the Avant-Garde and these tactical systems, which look to be mainly targeted at the US fleet and which are either air-launched or warship-launched. Now, we know much less about the Chinese programs, but we do know that the Chinese are developing a glide warhead system like the Russian strategic avant-garde system. The Chinese have provided what appear to be illustrations of it. And there is a theory that the Chinese are planning to install this on ballistic missiles launched from China. And it seems that the plan here is not to use it against the continental United States, but against US carrier groups in the Pacific and in the South China Sea. If that is correct, then it will change decisively the naval balance in the Pacific, because frankly, there being no defense against these systems, the United States will not be able to operate militarily against China anywhere which is within range of these systems.
So we have the hypersonic arms race, I guess, now starting up. Alexander Mercouris, thanks a lot for your analysis, your in-depth analysis on Lockheed Martin's contract and the development of hypersonic weapons, both by Russia, China, as well as the US. Guys, if you like this video, click the subscribe button down below and also click the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. Alexander Mercouris, thank you very much for joining the Duran. Everybody out there, take care until next time.